Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Alan Carey. It's my pleasure to be our moderator for our conversation this afternoon. Thrilled to have all of you joining us, both here in person in Washington, D.C. at the Cato Institute, as well as those of you joining us online from all around the world. Really excited to be presenting today's conversation, which is a partnership and a collaboration between Sphere Education Initiatives, the Cato Institute, and Moral Courage College. Really excited to be bringing to you all this conversation and film screening of the film Mississippi Turning. We're going to take a look a little bit at challenges around free speech, flag debates, engaging in productive disagreement, and how we can think about in a variety of settings the benefits of engaging across difference. Really pleased to be here with you all. A couple of notes before we begin today. For those of you joining us here in person, after the film, we'll be doing a panel conversation, a fireside chat with our panelists, some of the stars of the film, and digging into some of these topics. Afterwards, we'll be having Q&A. We'll dig in and take your questions, so please note those. For those of you joining us online, please make sure that you are adding those questions in the variety of formats that are available to you. We'll be taking those, using those as foundational for engaging in our conversation going forward. A brief word about Sphere before we jump in. Sphere Education Initiatives exists to work with educators all across the country on how to have challenging and difficult conversations, how to engage in things that promote civil discourse and viewpoint diversity, and most importantly, how to help people overcome the kind of polarization and tribalism that have been tearing us apart. For more information about Sphere, check out our website, sphere-ed.org. Before we begin with our film screening, I did want to start by introducing the producer of our film today and one of our co-hosts, a longtime friend of what we're doing with Sphere, Irshad Manji, who is the founder of the Moral Courage Project. Irshad, I'll turn over the stage to you.
Thank you so much, and hello, everybody. I have founded, as Alan mentioned, an organization called Moral Courage College, which exists to teach people how to turn heated issues into healthy conversations and sustained teamwork. And in that spirit, I want to offer you a tidbit about our society today. And it's a fascinating fact that I don't think most people know. We, the people, are not divided about issues that we are told are polarizing. In fact, there's a surprising amount of consensus about the issues that are labeled divisive. What we're divided about is one another. We don't trust each other, which is why we don't engage each other meaningfully. And by avoiding meaningful engagement, that distrust only deepens, which distracts us from all those issues on which we could be making substantive progress on. It's maddening. But what I want you to know is that you're going to watch, in a couple of minutes, a short documentary in which one of the two stars makes herself worthy of trust to the other. That is the great challenge and the opportunity before us today, to make ourselves worthy of trust to our others. And so I'd like to invite you to pay close attention to how Genesis B, who's here with us today, how she engages with Lewis, the other star of this documentary. And if you can remember, pay close attention to the very first thing that she says in the conversation with him, because we're going to pick up on that when it's time for the panel discussion. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoy, and more than anything, I hope we'll all grow from today's event. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us for that film, for engaging in that screening. Really excited to be joined today by a fantastic panel of experts. Go ahead, Tim, you can bring those up. We don't need to be that formal. I jumped on stage too soon, so I apologize. But really excited to be joined by a great panel today to talk a little bit about the film, but also talk about, thank you so much, the background of understanding how the film's conversation happens, how we can engage some of those challenging conversations about things like flag debates and social change and racial justice questions, all within that lens of thinking about productive disagreement. So to briefly introduce my friends and colleagues here on the panel today, I've already introduced immediately to my left Urshad Manji. She's the founder and president of Moral Courage College. Immediately to her left is Genesis B., artist and founder of People Not Things. And at the far end of the panel, friend and colleague Russ Lutino, who is the founder of Magnolia Tribune, news outlet in Mississippi. As we begin the conversation today, where I really wanted to take off was thinking a little bit about how we engage the background of how this story comes about. So we see the sort of poignant conclusion of a debate about the state flag of Mississippi. I wonder, and I'll start with you, Russ, if you could share just a little bit about how we got from a situation where the Mississippi flag was a popular one, and then over the course of the decades that you were involved in Mississippi politics, how things moved from a point where it was inconceivable that this change could happen to one where, as we saw at the end of the film, actually quite little debate and disagreement. It was actually a popular adoption of that change. So I wonder if you might walk us through a little bit about that story first.
Yeah, so Mississippi was founded in 1817, but we didn't actually have a state flag until 1861 at the start of the Civil War. And that flag was not the flag that you saw flying throughout the film. That flag actually was a flag that in the cannon had a magnolia. And that flag flew throughout the Civil War, and then in 1865, the flag was repealed. And then Mississippi didn't have a flag again until 1894, kind of the start of the lost cause mythology. And that is when they adopted the flag that we recently changed in 2020. An interesting tidbit before I get to answer your question. Actually, Mississippi didn't have a flag between 1906 and 2001. It repealed its entire code, which meant that it technically repealed the flag, although it kept flying. And it wasn't until they tried to change the flag that the Mississippi Supreme Court recognized that, in fact, we'd been flying one without actually having a statute to have a flag. But in 2001, there was an effort to change the flag. Governor Ronnie Musgrove was in office at the time. For decades, there had been conversation around changing the flag. And we speak about moral courage. I think it took a certain degree of moral courage at that point to say, I'm going to step out and be the one to start this conversation. The way that they started it, though, candidly was flawed. They did it through a statewide referendum, and they did it with a flag that candidly was pretty ugly as the alternative. And the atmosphere at that time, though, was much more charged than the atmosphere that we saw in 2020. So I was a 20-year-old college kid that happened to be working at First Baptist Church of Gulfport, which is close to where you were walking down Highway 90 there at the beginning of the film. And I can remember during the summer months there being a huge protest along Highway 90. It seemed like as far as the eye could see, there were people out with Confederate flags up and down Highway 90. And going out and having conversations with them and realizing that my point of view, which was that it was time to change the flag, was not the majority point of view in the state. And indeed, it ended up not being the majority point of view in the state. Some 66% of voters decided in that referendum that they wanted to keep the existing flag. But the motivation to change it didn't go away. And I would tell you that what happened is that it got a lot smarter. You saw businesses start to rise up and take an interest in it from a business perspective and saying, hey guys, this is really kind of hurting our ability to attract businesses, to create jobs in the state. The perception of this outside of Mississippi is not the same perception that 66% that voted for it in 2001 had. And so I think there was a steady sort of incremental pressure building around changing the flag, but there wasn't necessarily a single champion that had political influence and prominence to be able to actually do that. And that changed in 2015. At that time, the Speaker of the House, Philip Gunn, decided to just on again, moral courage, I think, step out and say that the current flag is inconsistent with my faith. Mississippi is a supermajority Republican state. He's a Republican. He runs supermajority Republican chamber in the House of Representatives. And he took a position that I think he knew was going to be unpopular, or thought was going to be unpopular that year. He stepped out, and there's this thing in Mississippi called the Neshoba County Fair. People in the audience may or may not have heard of it, but it's a big political thing that happens every summer, big speeches, hundreds and hundreds of people. And I remember going in 2015 after Speaker Gunn had made the announcement that it was time to change the flag, and there were signs all over the fairgrounds that said, "Keep the flag, change the speaker." And there was visible sort of anger towards the fact that he had taken this position. But he and others along the way were consistent, and they kept beating that drum. And then I think that consistency often meets up with a sparking event. And in some ways, the George Floyd incident was that sparking event, right? George Floyd happens, the country exhibits a degree of turmoil and protest. In Mississippi, it didn't look like it looked in a lot of other places. But what it did was to restart that conversation in a real way. And what we saw was that all of these different areas, faith groups that were coming out and saying, hey, we don't want to divide the body of Christ over a piece of cloth, right? So you had all these churches coming out and saying it's time to change the flag. You had all these business groups coming out and saying it's time to change the flag. You saw it in the film. The NCAA said, hey, we're not going to host events anymore in Mississippi until you guys change the flag. Lane Kiffin, who's the head football coach at Ole Miss, Mike Leach, who at the time was the head football coach at Mississippi State, go to the state capitol to lobby for the changing of the state flag. So you've got all these sort of interesting constituencies that in many ways would speak to or influence a Republican supermajority in a meaningful way, putting pressure. But I'd say this, and I'll wrap up. I don't think that was the reason legislators voted the way they did in the film. I think that was cover. Because the conversations that I had with legislators during that time were conversations about the inevitability of the flag changing. They were conversations about the fact that people of color shouldn't have to go into a courthouse and see a flag flying and wonder, am I going to get a fair shake? Because does this symbol really represent me, right? A symbol that's been used against me the way that it has. And it was conversations about how we present ourselves in a unified way moving forward. So it would be easy to say that the pressure is what caused legislators to cave. I think in some ways legislators were already ready for the change and the pressure gave them cover. And I don't want to undersell the kind of conversations that you were having that I think also happened at the Capitol between African American Democrat legislators and white Republican legislators, where they got to hear the same things that you were saying in the film, right? Directly from colleagues who they do trust, who they do work with, who they do admire. And so I'd wrap it up by just saying this. My experience at 20 years old was looking at a beach lined with Confederate flags and thinking, wow, I am really out of step with where the rest of the state is on this issue. And when the vote happened that they showed on the film took place, there were 2 protesters outside the Capitol. 2. And when the vote ultimately got taken in Mississippi to replace it with our current flag, 80 of 82 counties voted in favor of the current flag. That to me is a sign of progress that only comes from real conversations and over time getting people to see things through a different lens.
Russ, thank you for that. And I think that's a great segue to Genesis, hearing some more of your story. And I guess to begin, tell me a little bit about the step you took in terms of going from protest to engaging someone like Lewis. Like, how does that movement work for you? And then how was that experience as the two of you first got together? We saw some of that poignant interaction in the film, but I'd love to hear from your perspective. How was that, both for you and for Lewis?
It was a very jarring experience to do the one woman protest that I did. I didn't expect it to go viral. I just knew I had something on my chest that I wanted to say. I kept thinking of Emmett Till's face, just kept running through my mind. Every time I heard Confederate Heritage Month, Confederate, we're celebrating, I just thought about Emmett Till. And I said, I want to make a statement for him and my ancestors who lost their lives as well. I didn't know what to do with the newfound platform because it was everywhere, from New Zealand Times to Billboard to New York Times. It was support, but a lot of backlash and death threats, as you saw. And I couldn't see the barriers between myself and the people who were harassing me online. I was like, okay, I know racism. From what they were saying about me, I know it's racism, it's misogyny, it's homophobia, but also the internet. And because I couldn't see those barriers, I began to paint them, and they kind of developed into like what you see in my signature stroke, my signature painting style. And I kept asking Source, what do you want me to say? Because it felt like it was a divisive protest, but I think it just highlighted the division. It didn't create the division. It was already there. It brought eyes on a localized issue, national eyes on a localized issue. And I prayed to, whatever I prayed to. And I spoke to some of my mentors. Irshad was one of those mentors. And, it kind of just came to the conclusion, like, I want to speak face to face to some of the folks who were just disagreeing with me online. And I didn't feel like we were getting anywhere in the comment sections. I felt like they couldn't see me. And I felt in a lot of ways I couldn't see them too, because I have a lot of generational racial trauma. So I was also looking at them a way that I think was keeping me from seeing them as fully complex human beings worthy of dignity. I realized that in my meditations, and at the time I was drinking a lot. Like, it was just a very intense experience that I didn't have a blueprint for. So reaching out to Lewis, Lewis and I knew each other since we were children. We weren't friends or close, but like we rode the same school bus. So I have the image of Lewis as a little boy with his lunchbox on my school bus. And I'm just like, how do we diverge so much in our understanding of history? And I'm like, I wonder what he was taught. Because I know what I was taught, and I like history, and I've read the cornerstone speech of the Confederacy. I wonder what he's taught in his household, because I go to this museum, the Jeff Davis Museum, and it's a glorification of Confederacy and white supremacy. And I'm like, okay, he's probably taught that. I mean, I don't know. It was just one of those things where I wanted to get out of my own way for the sake of unifying my state. And I had to do a lot of deep work. I stopped drinking. I started doing my own meditations, my own practices to try to deprogram the bigotry I was holding, the trauma that I was holding, to make sure I'm seeing every human being as a complex human, worthy of dignity versus their race, versus their Confederates, supporting Confederacy. So it was a process. And it's a process I still continue until this day. It's been 6-7 years since I started on this journey.
So a lot in there that I'd love to dig into more, but I want to highlight just one piece, and I think bring you, Irshad, into the conversation, and that's the uniqueness of being able to go from an anonymous virtual engagement to saying, he comments, you follow up, and the two of you actually make that happen in real life. That measure of going from where so many of us stop as that express that outrage or anger or frustration online in the social media platforms, whatever it might happen to be, to a real conversation, a real opportunity of getting together in person. I can only imagine how challenging it was to take that first step and say, hey, do you want to meet and talk? So
it's scary.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that on your side, and then Irshad pulling you in, thinking about how you came to be involved in these conversations as well.
So it was scary because of my historic and my family background, how triggering like I'll use that word trigger. You know how triggering that symbol is, and someone who supports that symbol, for me, inherently being against my humanity, and inherently saying to me in my face that my ancestors deserve this, deserve the violence, the harassment, the assault, the castrations, the lynching. So it was scary to actually think about sitting down with somebody who might at any time say something that disrespects my ancestors, you know, just as he felt probably that I was disrespecting his ancestors, right? So I go back to that term scary, but it was just very uncomfortable. But I knew that it had to be done, because just as I led by example with the protests, I had to lead by example. If I call myself a peace activist and say I'm for unity, then I have to be uncomfortable sometimes and do the work on myself before I could even try to tell anybody to do anything, you know.
I love the fact, Genesis, that you point out how uncomfortable this was for you. As an educator, and we have a lot of educators watching this afternoon, I believe that my role is not to help my students feel safe. It's to help my students feel safe in their discomfort. And that's an important nuance. And it's because I was teaching at New York University that Genesis and I first met. She was a student there, I was a professor there, and over the course of 3-4 years, we developed a mentor-mentee kind of relationship. And I remember you asked me, what advice do you have for me, Professor, about what I'm experiencing now since the protest from the stage? And I suggested that it may be worthwhile to actually speak with Lewis face to face, and here's the key, to do so from a place of curiosity, not judgment. And you may have heard Genesis make that point in the film, that she was curious. And I don't think I needed to prompt you to do that. I know that you had questions. She was curious, why would anybody hang on to an ideology that sees me as less human, and by the way, that then motivates me to see them as less than they are, right? So I want to say one other thing about this experience. Lewis isn't here today. He suddenly passed away last year in his sleep. I'll tell you though, I spoke with him many times after the first conversation that Lewis and Genesis had. And I asked him, why did you show up for that conversation, knowing that there would be cameras there? Wasn't that scary? Her word. And he said, yeah, but I wanted to be heard. And I asked him, did you trust Genesis to hear you? He said, not at that point. But she engaged me with so much respect during that conversation that I came to trust her. And then I asked him, what do you mean by respect? And he said, I never experienced someone on the other side of the issue care enough about me and my life to wonder, where was I coming from? Why do I believe what I believe? And that brings me to the invitation I issued to all of you at the beginning of my short remarks. Do you remember how Genesis started her conversation with Lewis? She asked him a question, and not a judgy question. Do you not understand how that flag, undermines my dignity? No, nothing like that. She asked him a very sincere question. How does that flag make you feel? He responded, proud, makes me feel at home. And then do you remember what he did immediately after that? He asked her, how does it make you feel? What about you? He reciprocated. In the second conversation, we heard one of the participants say, if people don't know how to speak, nothing will get done. That's exactly what the skills that you brought to the table, Genesis, and I don't mean that strategically. I mean that sincerely. What you did to ensure that Lewis understood you were there in good faith and not to play gotcha, because you really did come from a place of wonder. That made all the difference.
Sure.
And it's something so many more of us can do in almost every conversation we have, whether it's about politics, whether it's about family. Think about that. Thanksgiving ain't too far away.
So social change is, as each of you up here know, extraordinarily complicated.
Yeah.
When it comes to thinking about things, whether that's changing flags, if it's about changing people's perceptions, their minds, their hearts, it's all very wrapped up in a whole variety of challenging issues. Two of them that we highlight a little bit in the subtitle of the event is that measure of free speech, whether that's protest or engaging in conversations. But I think the one that I want to spend a little bit more time on is this notion of productive disagreement. Building off of what you were talking about, Irshad, that notion of how do we engage with each other with open minds, with honesty, with that desire to learn. Not necessarily to change minds, though we're open to that as a next step. And how we get there. Russ, let me start with you, but I'd love to hear from each of you more broadly on this. Is thinking about this question of how productive disagreement helps bring about healthy conversation and often change. You were involved in a variety of different conversations in your role in politics in Mississippi over the years. What role did you see productive disagreement play in helping people overcome their differences?
I think we live in a society right now where the natural impulse is to assume the very worst of people who disagree with us, to assume their motivations are bad, to label them in a way that immediately marginalizes them. And I think that is the worst possible thing if your goal is to actually be productive. It makes you feel good, right? It makes you feel self-righteous. But my sense is that if you start from a place of genuine curiosity and trying to understand where people are coming from, that's a really important initial step. And I'll give a parallel sort of conversation. When the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum opened up in Jackson, we took a group of conservative activists and members of an African American church together and toured the Civil Rights Museum. And then we did a group discussion. That was like a 2.5 hour long discussion. And I literally just threw out some terminology to see how people responded. And one of the things I threw out was, well, how many people think states' rights is a good thing? And, all the conservative hands go up. And how many people think states' rights is a bad thing? And all the African American church members' hands go up. And what you figured out from the conversation was that their concept of that was so drastically different that neither one came with bad motives. That both saw states' rights, if it was negative, as an impingement on freedom, and if it was positive, as a guarantor of freedom. And so that was just a difference in experience that led people to, even in terms of language, see things differently. So I think starting with the thought process of, hey, when it came to the flag, there were lots of people in Mississippi who wanted to keep the flag who I don't believe were racist, who I don't believe started from a position of white supremacy. This is something I would say about Mississippi in general. We hate being told what to do. I've often joked that if somebody said, don't drink a gallon of bleach, and that person was from Washington, D.C., we'd start opening up gallons of bleach and putting it down. We just hate being told what to do. And so there's a sense almost of intransient pride that comes behind sticking to certain things, right? So I would say if you start from a point of view that says, I'm not going to assume that Lewis is a racist. I'm going to try and figure out why he believes this, and then I'm going to explain to him why it's hurtful to me, is like a much more productive conversation, right? Because it's on that human level. I mean, there are probably a million policy battles that I could point to where that was true. None of them were as emotional as the flag vote, because I think symbols are just powerful things. But
Genesis, a similar theme, having, as we saw in the film, sat down with a variety of different people to intently have these conversations, to learn and hear from each other. Tell me a little bit about your experience with productive disagreement. What worked best for you in doing that, and where was it most impactful in both your personal experience and working with the people that you engaged in these conversations?
Growing up, there was a lot of debate in my house. Like it was, that's how we passed time, was to debate. I have 2 older brothers, mother, father, a bunch of cousins, and we would just debate things, and it wasn't about I gotcha or humiliating anybody. We would just, I always say we all should have been lawyers, because that's all we did was just lawyers or politicians. So I wasn't really, it wasn't that new to me, but I had never really debated someone who could possibly not see me as fully human. That's very different. But I'm a strong believer in civil discourse. Or uncivil discourse, just depends, it depends on what it is. Pluralistic thought, I think, is so important, and I think a lot of the division that we see in our nation is a lot of censorship and canceling. It's not something I believe in. I think that it's important to bring as many voices to the table as possible who have lived experience in the issue, not just, I'm on TikTok, I made 100 TikToks on something, so I'm an expert. No, like lived experience and bringing people together to really get those multiple perspectives. So there's a meditation that I developed called conceptual resistance that I have to do before these civil discourse sessions, before I do panels. And it's basically focusing on an inanimate object and changing my line of sight from the position of, okay, her line of sight, his line of sight. How are they seeing this? How is he seeing this? Is he seeing me in the peripheral, right? It's, like all of these different sensory, line of sight, noise, breath. And it strengthens the muscle to be able to see multiple perspectives at once and come to the conclusion that your perspective is inherently incorrect to everybody else except you. So that's how I approach the world now. And so I don't feel offended if someone doesn't see something the same way. I think that's actually the inevitability, right? It's not, so my whole worldview has shifted from having these discussions and doing the work on myself to see the world for really what it is, not exactly how I want it to be.
That's fantastic. And one of the things that comes across so clearly in the film and in your relationship with Lewis is that each of you, in approaching that conversation with that measure of humility, see something different in each other as a result. You both, by engaging in that conversation, you move in that conversation, not necessarily on your position about the flag, but on your orientation toward each other.
Sure.
I wonder if you might say a little bit about how having that conversation helped change your orientation toward how you saw him and how he saw you.
Lewis has a huge heart, and I think you can kind of see it in the film, without really getting to know him. Not saying he's perfect. He, just like all of us, has a lot of issues and was deeply flawed, just as I am deeply flawed. But he had a big heart, and it was like I was able to see that sitting across from him probably for like 10 minutes, but to be able to see the nuances of somebody is very different than being online with them. After, we became friends after, and Lewis started to get involved with doing clothing drives and food drives for our homeless siblings in Mississippi and getting really involved, trying to do more community work. He got really rooted in his faith as a Christian man, and Yeah, he was on the upswing of a lot of things. You know, he was expecting a new child like right before he passed. So it just made me further understand that I'm on the right track when I say seeing every human as a complex human being worthy of dignity first, before I see anything else about you, your physical characteristics, where you're from, how rich you are, how poor you are. So my reaction and my relationship with Lewis has kind of validated that for me and given me more steam to come out in the world and say my message of people, not things. It was, because of him.
So to preface my next question, I think the long answer is go check out Moral Courage College. But the short version of it, Irshad, I'd love if you could talk just a little bit about, in your work, in your writing, the things that you do, how people can start to take these actions themselves. And first interacted with the story of Genesis and Lewis through your book, Don't Label Me, which is fantastic. Go buy a copy, or 7 for all of your friends. But through your work with Moral Courage College, through your work with people all across the country, how do you help them start to take these steps as well? Thinking about how they can be active in changing both themselves, but being open to the fullness of others.
So I will keep it short, uncharacteristically. First by saying, yes, please go to moralcourage.com, but specifically go to the About Us page, because that's where you can watch an 8-minute video that equips you with the skills to do the kinds of things that you watch Genesis and Lewis do. The one thing, though, that I would say that people really need to overcome is this notion that, well, if I engage across differences, I'm going to have to compromise what I believe. And that is simply not true. Remember the film. Genesis didn't change her mind about the issue. She changed her perspective on Lewis. And similarly, even after that first conversation, Lewis didn't change his mind about the flag. You might remember in the second conversation with the others, he blurted out, well, I don't see how a symbol can oppress anybody. He did not change his mind about the flag. He changed his mind about Genesis. And so what the skills of moral courage equip people to do is to stand their ground and at the same time create common ground. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but all it is a delicious paradox. Standing your ground is about what you believe. Creating common ground is about how you express what you believe. So if you can leave your other feeling respected, feeling heard, not agreed with, but heard, you've just motivated them to give you a fair hearing in return. And it may not happen in that first conversation. It did with Genesis and Lewis. But don't be discouraged if it doesn't happen in that first conversation. We are all works in progress. And just to that point, because Lewis felt so much respect from Genesis, he told me he started asking uncomfortable questions at home. Hey, Dad, why is it that we always tell black folks to let it roll off their backs? Why don't we ever let it roll off our backs? And the final conversation I had with him, I was checking some facts for my book. And he told me that just a couple of days before that phone call from me, he had taken the Confederate flag flying in his family's backyard. He had taken it down, neatly folded it up, and placed it in a box that he labeled Things of the Past. It took him a good 1.5 years to ingest all the information, all the questions, all the perspectives that he was motivated to investigate because he knew that Genesis was not playing gotcha. So give people time and give yourself time. And that's something that in our culture of instant gratification, we tend not to do. We think we're in a crisis of time as we're doom scrolling for 2 and 3 hours a day. That's time too, right? No, we're not in a crisis of time. We're in a crisis of trust. And you now know what you can do to alleviate that crisis.
So what I wanted to do next is open it up for questions from our audience. For those of you online, again, please, as a reminder, send your questions in. We'll be engaging in those. For those of you in person, we have people running microphones. So let's come over here to this gentleman for the first question.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I certainly appreciate the production and its true intention, and I say that with a great deal of respect. I think you're one of the most interesting people I've seen on stage here in Cato, and I've been to many Cato events. And I will say this with a great deal of respect, and I say this, that how do you know when you've honestly accomplished anything that's beyond symbolism? And the reason I say that is because on my way here, I saw an act of racism between black people. Black people who don't like each other. Black people who were shooting. I saw black people shooting each other. I saw lots of things. Most of the crime goes on is black on black violence, at least in this city. So how do you address that? And how do you know when the changing of the flag statistically helps, provides more jobs, provides more hope, provides more access? How do you know when your symbolism actually develops into something that's real?
That's a great question. Thank you. Thank you for that. The short answer is I don't know. I don't know. I have a tattoo on my stomach that says, I will not see the extent of my influence within my lifetime, but my existence will not be in vain. And I try not to get caught up because it's out of my control. Speaking of Cato Institute and Stoicism, it's out of my control. I can only do what I can. And on the topic of black on black violence, I have an organization that's about youth empowerment, and I'm a hip hop artist as well as visual artist, and a lot of my work speaks to loving ourselves so that loving each other comes easily. I posted a poem today on my Instagram, You and I. Imagine how high we could fly if we wasn't at each other's throats shooting down each other's hopes. And what does it mean for us as black folks to truly come together as a collective? We'd be absolutely unstoppable. And there's so much division in our community. I was telling Irshad this on our Big Think shoot the other week, that me engaging Lewis or me engaging the side of white supremacy, I don't think that that's paramount. I think it's paramount within my community of black community, whether it's black men and black women. We see them getting at each other online, whether it's queer, black, straight, black. We have so much healing to do with each other and loving on each other to do and meeting each other where we're at. That's my message for my own community. But it also, again, starts with me, and it starts with you, and doing what we can to send love to our people, to meet each other where we're at, to have those difficult conversations with each other, rather than just being a spectator of the violence. What can we do? It could be small or large, but you can only do what you can do. And I try not to get hung up on anything outside of what's within my control and my action. But I really appreciate that question. It's so important. It's a very important question.
Can I say one more thing? Just one more closing thing. I just want to say thank you for that answer, by the way. I feel like we're connected somehow. But I think it takes much more than just black folks helping each other. We've got to incorporate everybody in this. And I know you know that. I was on my way to Howard University Hospital, 3 o'clock in the morning. I heard 5 gunshots, literally right in front of the hospital. I walked into the emergency room. I had some problems myself, but it wasn't a gunshot, thank you. But I saw 2 youth walking in with blood all across. I don't know what they were doing, but I'm assuming it was a transaction of some sort. Okay, so I like what you said, but to a certain degree, you got to stay away to protect yourself, because the more you get involved, the closer you are at putting yourself in harm's way. So I know you've been able to do that because you wouldn't be sitting here, if it wasn't for your sense of your common sense. So thank you again for being here.
Absolutely. But we can't be afraid of each other. We can't be afraid of each other, and we can't be afraid of our youth. We really have to get out of our comfort zone and engage our youth. And if we're talking about systemic reasons, whether it's addiction, whether it's drugs or policies that make these things pervasive within the city of Washington, D.C., I don't know the city, whether it's poverty or lack of access to education, lack of access to jobs, all of these things correlate. It's very complex. We have to pick one of them and do what we can with each one, but we can't be afraid of each other. Can't stay away from our people, and especially our youth.
Can I speak a little bit about maybe some of the ways that I think that it has had a positive impact? I would tell you that, I don't know if you heard it on the film or not, but the applause that lasted in the Senate chamber when it passed lasted for like 5 minutes. I was there. We had about 100 people that came up to the Capitol for the vote that day. And there was a strong sentiment of brotherhood, for lack of a better way to put it, across racial divides, across partisan divides, that lasted for a considerable period of time. And I actually was very proud of Mississippi because you have a lot of turmoil going on across the country. I thought we dealt with it constructively, and there was a moment of unity. To your point, though, that sentiment fades over time. Right. What I can tell you from a practical sense is we've had investments from companies like Google and Amazon since we changed the flag, and I've had economic developers tell me that it's a part of their consideration. Amazon just made a $10 billion investment in Canton, Mississippi, and then in Jackson, Mississippi, for data centers. And so those are the kinds of things that long-term create opportunity for people in Mississippi. I'll say one other thing. I mentioned Mississippi pride. I'm proud of Mississippi. There's a lot of things that I think historically we get bad raps for. Some of it's deserved and some of it's not deserved. But I'll give you as an example. 10 years ago, Mississippi was ranked 50th in education. Today, Annie Casey says we're 32nd. Now, 32nd may not be as good as first, but in 10 years, that's an 18-state move. African Americans on the NAAP reading test, 4th grade reading test, went from last in the country to 5th best in the country amongst African Americans. So the state is, I think, making progress. That doesn't mean that we've solved all these problems, but you see, we just had a historic investment in education, an additional $300 million in our education formula this year that's designed to go to low-income students. So it increased a 5% weight that was applied to low-income students up to a 30% weight for low-income students for student funding. And so I do think there's a recognition, and I do think that there's been progress that's worth celebrating.
So we have time for a couple more questions. Any others from our audience? So come over here and then there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the touching film and the great discussion. In Europe, we have the discussion in different countries about the question whether different symbols should be prohibited or forbidden. One concrete example is about the Nazi Nazi flag. And my question would be, where do you see the limits of these symbols between free speech when they are so closely linked to violence and so explicitly? I'm less aware of the history of the Confederate flag, so maybe the parallel is not perfect. But especially in the case of the Nazi flag, what would be the arguments for or against forbidding it in the public space?
What do you think, Irsha?
So actually, I think it is a very good parallel. Of course, it's not perfect, different contexts, different histories, different populations, Nazi symbol versus the Confederate battle emblem. But the reality is that both are steeped in violence and the encouragement of violence. And so something that Genesis said in the film, I thought was a very wise, very mature distinction. She said, look, I don't want to stop anybody from flying the Confederate battle flag in their homes. That's their personal property, and, you know, who am I to say that they can't recognize or celebrate their ancestors in the way that they choose? But it's a different matter when you place that flag in a public space and expect me, as a citizen of that body politic, to be and feel represented by it. Right? So private and public, I think, is one way of thinking about this. The other point to add, I guess, is that just as Mississippians don't like being told what to do, turns out most humans don't like being told what to do. And we know from history that when any change is imposed, even in the name of it being a solution, it winds up solving nothing because it doesn't have buy-in by more than one side. And so when the other side comes into power, as it most assuredly will, one way or the other, that so-called solution will be used as a hammer to suppress, not just solutions like it, but the people who advocated it. So, would I like to see the Nazi symbol done away with? Of course. But if you simply ban it, you'll have the illusion of having eradicated it.
And possibly make it stronger.
And possibly make it stronger by driving it underground. And for anybody here who does not follow European politics as closely as I do or this gentleman does, the far right is making a massive comeback in many parts of Europe today. And so people will hit the panic button over that. But it's precisely that panic button that becomes part of the problem.
I was reminded earlier today of a quote from Friedrich Hayek that talks about freedom only given when it's known that the consequences will be good is not freedom at all. Part of a broader discussion that he has about the importance of people being able to engage, being able to challenge, to be able to go through a variety of different situations and explore different options. And sometimes that comes with unpleasant consequences, but so often it's that measure of being able to, in situations like we're discussing today, change people's hearts, in addition to engaging their minds.
Right.
In the name of time, I want to quick hit the question here, and then I have a wrap-up one for you, Irshad, before we go to our final comments.
Thank you for a marvelous discussion, and I think you in many ways have answered my question already, especially with your most recent responses. But Genesis, you said at the beginning of this part of the program, how do I get out of my own way to deal with this moment? And that's where I find myself, because I got triggered watching the film, discovering that you mentioned God on the state flag. And to me, that word is divisive, because I'm sure you're talking about a Christian God, and I'm very concerned about Christian nationalism and the position it takes on many of our rights and freedoms. That said, I'm curious about how that became mentioned on the new flag.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so it's been a part of our state motto on the state seal. I would say that Mississippi is still a deeply religious place. I don't associate that religion with what we now see as Christian nationalism. Personally, I don't. I would tell you that support for that phrase on the flag helped to get the flag changed. And that absent that phrase on the flag, it's not that it wouldn't have changed, but I don't think you would have seen the kind of excitement and unity that came out of it. And I'd say that on both the Republican and Democrat side of the political aisle, that, you know, Mississippi is just still a very deeply religious state.
Baby steps. Maybe the next one won't have that divisive, because there's a lot of atheists in the state like that feel that don't represent them. We get that question a lot, actually, but I agree with you.
I have to say I respectfully disagree. Now, how you feel is how you feel. I'm certainly not, invalidating your feelings. But quick story, I became a U.S. citizen last year. And during my interview, I answered a question that included, among the rights we have as Americans. And one of those rights is to worship or not worship as we feel fit. And so the right to not worship was something that the interviewer, the officer, wanted to hear me, articulate. And moments later, I found myself in an oath-taking ceremony in which, so help me God, was part of the oath. And all I did was not say it. And I get that Christian nationalism would take that right away if it became the kind of theocratic power that you worry that it perhaps already is or certainly can become. But I think that if we recognize, as a final thought here, that everybody is a plural. We are all so much more than meets the eye. We are all complex beings with inherent dignity. If we can just remember that about one another, then even those whom you may fear right off the bat are Christian nationalists. If you were to find an occasion, a way, a reason to ask a few sincere questions, you might actually find, that some of these individuals don't mean to come off the way the script makes them sound. And you saw just how open Lewis was to what Genesis had to say, precisely because she did not fear him and did not assume about him what somebody else might, given his position on the Confederate battle emblem. So let's first recognize everybody is a plural, yourself included, and keep that in mind when we think to ourselves, I have nothing to say to that person, because that person obviously wants to hurt me. It may not be obvious, and it may be worth seeking to engage.
As we wrap up for our conversation today, something that came up online reminded me the event today, and the filming was a special viewing of this event. That is, unlike most of our recordings, you won't be able to immediately find the film that we just watched directly online. But the question asked, and I'll repeat for Irshad and Genesis, how do people watch this going forward? If there are people who are excited about this film, they're eager to show it to family and friends, they want to organize viewing parties, whatever it might happen to be,
Wonderful.
How do they do so?
Well, I'm happy to say that we'll be releasing this film publicly in the fall of this year. Initially, we thought that it would be a message of hope, exactly, as Russ pointed out, it has been for Mississippi in a very noisy presidential election year. That if we, again, remember, we ourselves don't need to get caught up in who becomes president, but that regardless, we can take decisions, make choices, and do deeds in our own neighborhoods, in our own families, in our own states that alleviate the the nastiness of national politics, then this is a film that will teach people what they can do. So please go to moralcourage.com and sign up for our newsletter. Just go to the Contact Us page, or go to moralcourage.com/newsletter. And there you'll be able to sign up, and we'll keep everybody on our subscription list posted about exactly when it'll be released and where, therefore, you'll be able to show it to your students, possibly invite me and Genesis to engage with your students. And I'll say one final thing about this before I turn it over to my co-panelists. We're very interested at Moral Courage in working with educators who can come up with interesting ways of engaging their students about the lessons of this film. So if after watching this film you think, I would really love to help Moral Courage develop resources for fellow educators, please get in touch with us. Team, T-E-A-M, team at moralcourage.com, or contact us through the website.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I can be reached at peoplenotthings.com. I do public speaking, live performances, live paintings, interviews. If any of you are interested in learning more about my process and how I arrived to the actions above, and my ongoing practices as well. And I'm on Instagram at GenesisB. That's B-E. Yeah. Thank you all for having us.
Russ, any final words?
No, I appreciate being here. I would just say that what you did is important, obviously. I think we've got to find a way to scale these sorts of conversations. And so much of what we see right now, and we were talking about social media earlier, it's performative, right? It invites people to be performative, and the goal is to win against somebody else. And at the heart of these kinds of conversations is the humility to go into a conversation not ready to get rid of your position or surrender your position, but to me, the humility to say, I might learn something that changes what I think. My goal is not to impose on someone else. And if we're doing more of that, we're going to make more progress.
That's right.
Amen.
With that, Genesis, Irshad, Russ, thank you all so much for joining us today.